Jo Yoonho and Jung Hyunho are seated on their couch. Jumping to the present, Yoonho, now relatively unknown despite her 14 years of experience, has developed a reputation for being challenging. Her ex, Hyunho, on the other hand, has become a popular announcer at the same station. When her boss requested she switch her time slot, Yoonho expressed her frustration openly. Following her complaints, she's unexpectedly assigned to share the slot with Hyunho after her original partner backs out. The two immediately find themselves at odds, with Yoonho boldly suggesting that Hyunho still has feelings for her. After a heated back and forth, they manage to get through the show together. Later, over lunch, Yoonho's colleague Moon Jeon, who's taken a liking to her, makes a gentle attempt to persuade her to consider dating him. On the following weather report, Yoonho appears well-dressed, hoping to make an impression. But just as she's wrapping up, Hyunho suddenly steps in and takes over, leaving her furious. When she confronts him afterward, she learns that her skirt had ripped, and Hyunho had intervened to spare her from embarrassment. Later, in a casual chat with Jeon, she agrees to go on a date with him, unaware that Hyunho has overheard. Hyunho discreetly arranges for Jeon to be assigned an out-of-town story over the weekend, disrupting their date plans. Yoonho finds herself drawn to the story, intrigued by the rare opportunity for extended screen time, which spans 14 years with a maximum of only 14 minutes on air. When she mentions her interest to Jeon, he reacts with disappointment. In response, Yoonho suggests he join her on the assignment. After a demanding day out in the rain, Jeon drops Yoonho at her place and confronts her, wanting to know her true feelings. She admits she's still emotionally entangled with Hyunho and reveals that their breakup partly stemmed from his unwillingness to consider marriage. Jeon, however, tries to shift her perspective, and their conversation leads to a kiss. Elsewhere, Yoonho's alternate personality, Hae-ri, appears in a psychiatrist's office, describing her struggle with memory lapses and dreams of becoming an announcer. Meanwhile, Jo Yeon receives a call from his mother, who accidentally refers to him by his brother's name. The next day, Hae Yeon tried to ask Jo Yeon out for a meal, but he declined repeatedly, despite her persistence. As Hae-ri spoke with Min Young, Jo Yeon arrived to pay his parking fee and she quickly hid. Later, a protester at the station tried to attack Jo Yeon, and Hae-ri jumped in, stopping the attacker and helping him escape. While hiding, she suddenly kissed him and left. At home, she was shocked to see Hyunho waiting, calling her Yoonho, the woman from her dreams. She remembered her doctor calling her by that name, and with confusion fading, realized she was indeed Yoonho. Yoonho and her younger sister, Hae-ri, play together, displaying a bond so close that Yoonho feels Hae-ri's emotions as her own. In the present, Hae-ri insists to both Hyunho and her psychiatrist that she isn't Yoonho, pointing to a non-existent scar from her childhood as proof. The psychiatrist suggests she may have dissociative identity disorder, DID, though Hae-ri records her thoughts in her journal, feeling the doctor is wrong. At precisely 4 a.m. and 4 p.m., the personalities of Yoonho and Hae-ri alternate after deep sleep, each waking with no memory of what the other did. At 4 a.m., Yoonho heads to the office, encountering Hyunho without recalling their previous interaction. She notices Jeon acting distant after she turned down his feelings. After her day, Yoonho goes to bed, and at 4 p.m., Hae-ri awakens to start her shift as a parking attendant, hiding from Joo-yeon and reasoning that after getting close, avoiding him is best. Meanwhile, she continues filling a jar with 1,000 paper stars. Later that evening, Joo-yeon finds Hae-ri at work and bluntly questions her about their kiss. Startled, she begins to cry, and he leaves her alone. The alternating schedule persists, with Hae-ri eventually gifting Joo-yeon the jar of paper stars, and a note explaining that her kiss was because she liked him. Joo-yeon recalls her helpfulness, and, touched by her kindness, decides to meet Hee. As they talk, he mentions that he was not angry because of the kiss, but he felt weird after it. Hae-ri then openly expressed her feelings. Jo-yeon also mentions that he is also intrigued by her. Once they clear things up, Hae-ri visits Joo-yeon's house, admiring it and asking about family photos as he explains who's in them. Jo-yeon shared with Hae-ri that his older brother had passed away, an event that had severely impacted his mother's mental health. Hae-ri comforted him, eventually staying over for the night. The next morning, Yoonho awakens in Joo-yeon's house, startled and confused. She looks around, but she was at a place she doesn't know. Seeing his ID card on the table, she realizes who he is, gathers her belongings, and quickly heads to the office. At the station, Hyunho turns down a major story. suggesting that Yoon-ho take it instead. Yoon-ho is paranoid and stressed about the previous night since she doesn't know the place she woke up in. During the assignment, Yoon-ho steps into a freezer truck and is horrified to find a dead body inside. The door suddenly locks, trapping her. She panics, nearly sending a message to Hyuno for help. She hesitated for a while before ultimately reaching out to her crew instead. However, the lead writer ignores the text. Eventually, another crew member arrives and frees her. She told him about the body in the freezer, and as he was looking inside, she saw Hyuno arriving with the police. He approached her and told her to come, and she followed as he walked. Later, Yoon-ho questions his reasons for coming, and he casually remarks about the PD being intoxicated. Yoon-ho stresses that he shouldn't feel obliged to come to her rescue, even in dire situations, while noticing his mismatched shoes. Hyuno responds somewhat defensively that he's trying to help partly because he feels embarrassed by her as his former girlfriend. The following day, one of the station's least favored employees returns, loudly announcing his comeback, much to his boss's shock, who promptly shuts the door upon seeing him. In the meantime, Jo-yeon is preoccupied with waiting for Hae-ri, who has been absent from work since the night she stayed over at his place. The following day, Jo-yeon finds Hae-ri and openly expresses his feelings, hinting that next time he hopes they'll wake up together. Later that night, Hae-yoon and a co-worker stumble upon Jo-yeon and Hae-ri together, leaving them both in shock. As Yoon-ho and Ji-yeon prepare for a broadcast, the CEO confronts Yoon-ho, criticizing her sharply. The next day, Jae-young starts asking around the office about Yoon-ho's sister, mentioning he recently spotted someone who looked like her. Yoon-ho later faces harsh criticism from her peers and senior announcers for disregarding their unspoken rules by taking on 2 field reporting assignments. Hyuno approaches her, expressing a wish that she learns to be self-reliant and resilient without depending on him. However, Yoon-ho cuts the conversation short, asking him not to contact her again. Shortly after, Jae-young casually remarks to Yoon-ho that he saw someone identical to her working at another station's parking lot. Given her sister's death, it couldn't have been her. Yoon-ho bristles at this, firmly correcting him that her sister is, in fact, alive. Yoon-ho receives word about Jo-yeon and heads to meet him, yet Jo-yeon finds her first, just as Hyuno arrives. Trying to avoid Hyuno's gaze, Yoon-ho shields her face while Jo-yeon openly calls her by Hae-ri's name. Yoon-ho notices Hyuno's presence and quickly retreats to the bathroom. Overwhelmed, she shatters the mirror in front of her, before fainting from the intense distress. Later, she awakens in the nurse's office with Jo-yeon by her side. He mentions the broken mirror, and she lightly promises to repay him. When he probes about her sudden departure, she deflects with light-hearted jokes. In a subsequent session with her psychiatrist, Hae-ri admits that she's content because she's in love, unwilling to let go of this state, even if it means avoiding recovery to preserve her sense of self. Returning home, Hae-ri writes a letter to Yoon-ho, asking her to give her the body. The next day, Yoon-ho wakes to find Hae-ri's letter. At work, Hyun-oh approaches her with questions about the previous day. Yoon-ho gets her phone repaired and attempts to reach Ju-yeon, but he doesn't respond. Meanwhile, Ju-yeon confronts the press director over his inappropriate behavior toward women. Later, Jo-yeon shares the details of this confrontation with Hae-ri over a meal. By chance, Hae-ri encounters the press director herself and is on high alert when he taps her chest with a parking ticket. Her outburst escalates the situation, leading the director to kneel and apologize profusely. Later on, Hae-yoon meets Hae-ri to discuss the incident, amused by how Hae-ri managed to secure the press director's apology. She points out that he's the type who targets only those unlikely to speak up. Their conversation extends over dinner, where they are eventually joined by Jo-yeon. Partway through the meal, Jo-yeon is called away for an emergency and asks Hae-ri to come with him. Together, they head to the hospital, where Ju-yeon's mother is distressed. The following day, despite initially declining an invitation for a weekend work trip, Yoon-ho joins after all, only to realize the location is the same forest where Hae-ri disappeared. Though the area is known to be dangerous, she sneaks away from the group and hikes to the field where Hae-ri was last seen. There, waves of guilt wash over her as she recalls that Hae-ri hadn't wanted to go on the trip, and if not for her own insistence, Hae-ri might never have gone missing. The next day, during a broadcast covering a story about an older sister abandoning her mentally disabled younger sister, who later needed hospitalization, Yoon-ho suddenly suffers a panic attack. Hyun-oh, reporting alongside her, gently reassures her, barely managing to help her regain composure. They finish the broadcast, and Hyun-oh, sensing her distress, leads her away by holding her hand. Inside the elevator, Yoon-ho initially asks him to leave, but when he questions her sincerity, she hesitates, and they share a kiss as she clings to him for comfort. In their childhood, Hae-ri and Eun-ho share a memory captured in a camping photo. Now, Yoon-ho wakes up to find Hyun-oh nearby, who then takes her out for a meal. She questions if the events of the previous day, including their kiss, were real, and Hyun-oh confirms they were. The following morning, Yoon-ho again finds Hyun-oh by her side. This brings back memories of the past, when she had once asked Hyun-oh about marriage, only for him to abruptly end things, admitting he wasn't ready for that step. That night, as he prepared to leave, he saw her crying in her sleep, which changed his mind, leading him to stay. Elsewhere, Hyun-oh accompanies Yoon-ho to the psychiatric clinic she frequents, where she learns for the first time that she has dissociative identity disorder. The doctor explains how Hae-ri has been attending sessions, and Yoon-ho finally shares that Hae-ri is her younger sister who disappeared years ago. Flashbacks reveal that their parents had died in a car accident when they were young, leading their grandmother to care for them. Yoon-ho had insisted that Hae-ri join the graduation trip to become more independent and build friendships, but Hae-ri went missing. Not long after, their grandmother passed away, leaving Yoon-ho entirely alone. Eventually, Yoon-ho found Hae-ri's diary, the first sign of her own split identity. She then spent 3 years as a parking attendant, living as Hae-ri to fulfill her sister's unspoken wishes, often skipping night work opportunities to focus on morning broadcasts. Meanwhile, Hae-ri's sudden absence worries Ju-yeon, who checks the parking booth, where another attendant hands him a phone Yoon-ho had left behind in the bathroom, just before she fainted and began embodying Hae-ri. After leaving the clinic, Yoon-ho and Hyun-oh continue spending time together, sharing moments cooking and eating. Meanwhile, Ju-yeon and Hae-yeon work on a project covering popular travel stops. Hae-yeon encounters friction with a senior colleague, Sun-bae, who resents Hae-yeon's growing presence in the spotlight. During this time, Jo-yeon makes an impulsive trip from Busan to Seoul, taking a taxi all the way to see Hae-ri at her home. However, upon arrival, he finds Yoon-ho and Hyun-oh together, appearing close and leaving him confused and disheartened. Reluctantly, Hae-yeon compromises, sharing her script with Sun-bae. Sun-bae, in turn, mentions a rumor insinuating that Hae-yeon uses her personal life to advance at work. Unbothered, Hae-yeon firmly replies that she's done nothing against her principles. One morning, Yoon-ho wakes to find Hyun-oh missing. He's just stepped out to get groceries. Soon, they head out to enjoy her favorite meal. However, during their outing, Hyun-oh receives a call informing him that one of the grandmothers he knows has been injured and is now in the hospital, prompting him to leave immediately. A flashback reveals a moment from their past breakup when Yoon-ho pleaded with him to stay. Tearfully composed, Hyun-oh had told her that she would eventually want marriage, and he, not wanting to marry, felt he would only hold her back if they stayed together. In the present, Hyun-oh returns to Yoon-ho's door, urging her, in a tender moment, to let herself lean on others from time to time. But Yoon-ho, clearly ready to move on, responds that she won't need to anymore. With that, she says goodbye and closes the door, marking the end of their chapter. Hyun-oh attends a funeral, and it becomes evident that contrary to what he once claimed, he does indeed want to marry someday. However, his commitment to caring for the grandmothers in his life creates a conflict with his hopes for marriage. In a flashback to the early days of their relationship, Yoon-ho once brought up marriage, only for Hyun-oh to quickly make it clear that he had no plans to ever marry. In the present, Hyun-oh rushes out and sits alone in his car, noticing a necklace hanging from the rearview mirror. This necklace, a parting gift from his mother, holds sentimental value. She had left him and his father with it years before. As Hyun-oh recalls, he grew up in a chaotic home marked by his father's gambling addiction, yet he worked hard, determined to keep the promise he made to his mother to make something of himself. Moon Ji-yeon and Soo Jong, Hyun-oh's childhood neighbors, shared a similar struggle. Their family's debt and eventual abandonment by their mother led them to repeatedly visit the gambling house, repaying their debts bit by bit. After a devastating fire claimed his father's life and left Hyun-oh responsible for his father's debts, one of the gambling house owners offered him an arrangement. She would fund his living expenses and education if he would look after the elderly women associated with the house. Hyuno accepted, bargaining for Jeon and Soo-jung to live there as well. Gradually, the cramped storage room where Hyuno slept transformed into a real home, with family photos filling the walls over time. When one of the grandmothers passed away, it stirred something in Hyuno, sparking a desire to have a family of his own someday. Yoon Shin-young, one of the women in their household, noticed that the grandmothers hoped for him to marry and build a family. Yet, she quietly doubted that Yoonho, his girlfriend, could adapt to their unique family dynamic, which revolved around caring for the elderly. In the present, Hyuno reflects on the necklace, which Yoonho had once found and returned to him. Filled with a sudden urgency, he goes back to see her. He gently asks if she could occasionally let herself rely on him, but Yoonho only smiles, refusing, and closes the door, leaving him feeling disheartened. He then heads to the hospital and finds that the injured grandmother is stable, having only sustained a fractured leg. Meanwhile, at the office, Hyuno learns he's been passed over for the 9 p.m. news anchor position, with Jae-young taking the role instead. It turns out that Hyuno had struck a deal with the press director, agreeing to give up the main news spot in exchange for keeping Yoonho in the 12 p.m. slot. When Yoonho discovers this, she is livid. She tells him that, despite feeling like a disappointment to him, she tried not to interfere with his career. She leaves the office in tears, and in the elevator, memories of happier days with Hyuno come flooding back. She recalls asking him why he chose to date her. That day, he had rushed her to a taxi, and through a message, simply replied, "Because I love you." At the Media and Seoul office, a scandal erupts after a photo surfaces of Jo-yeon and Hee-yoon outside a hotel room. Despite Jo-yeon's explanation that they only shared some soju together, the rumors persist, and Hee-yoon faces the worst of the backlash, ultimately apologizing publicly and being removed from her night news slot. The following day, Yoonho takes on Hyori's persona once again and arranges a meeting with Jo-yeon. Jo-yeon attends a professional gathering and is taken aback to notice a bandage on Yoonho's hand, a reminder of her alter ego. Yoonho decides to embrace Hyori's identity to understand the joy her sister found in life. She begins working at a parking station, where she encounters Jo-yeon, meeting him as Hyori. In their conversation, she subtly hints at having an older sister, while Jo-yeon, covering his own motives, explains that he visited Hyori's home because he missed her. Coincidentally, on the day Jo-yeon's department has a dodgeball game, Yoonho steps in as his partner, filling in for Hye-yoon, who's sidelined with an injury. As the game begins, Yoonho excels, enjoying herself. During the match, she sustains a small injury and ends up with a bandage on her hand. Yoonho feels fulfilled by the day's events, and later, Jo-yeon drives her home, handing her a mobile phone he'd had repaired, believing it belonged to her. Yoonho, staying in character, claims it's her sister's phone. Although Jo-yeon accepts her explanation, a sense of doubt lingers. The following morning, Yoonho approaches the press director, attempting to persuade him to reinstate Hyun-oh on the 9 p.m. news, but her efforts are unsuccessful. She turns to her team manager, who half-jokingly remarks that Jae-young's poor performance as anchor could ultimately lead to Hyun-oh reclaiming the slot. Meanwhile, Hyun-oh is demoted back to a cubicle. As he and Ji-yeon prepare for a broadcast, they find themselves in a heated exchange, where Ji-yeon questions him about his feelings for Yoonho. Later, the team manager tasks Hyun-oh with taking Yoonho to Media and Seoul's office for a collaborative project. Upon arrival, Hyun-oh warmly greets Ju-yeon, expressing his enthusiasm about working with him. Jo-yeon, meeting Yoonho officially for the first time, quickly notices the bandage on her hand, matching the wound he'd seen on Hyori from Dodgeball Day. A flashback reveals that Ju-yeon had once glimpsed his own contact saved in Yoonho's phone, prompting him to make the trip from Busan to Seoul and watch Yoonho with Hyun-oh from a distance. Later, Ju-yeon finds himself outside Yoonho's home, and they go to a nearby restaurant to talk. During the conversation, Ju-yeon confronts her about pretending to be Hyori, finally uncovering the truth about Yoonho's dissociative identity disorder and understanding that she wasn't simultaneously involved with both him and Hyun-oh. Despite learning that Hyori is a part of Yoonho rather than a separate person, Jo-yeon resolves to wait patiently for Hyori to return. At the office, Jae-young unexpectedly impresses everyone with a flawless performance on his first 9 p.m. news broadcast, leaving the team manager in astonishment. The next morning, Yoon-ho receives this news as well. A series of flashbacks reveal Hyun-ho and Yoon-ho's life together in the past and how much effort Hyun-ho put into securing the 9 p.m. slot. Largely motivated by the wish for his mother to see him on the news from anywhere, he sacrificed countless weekends and tirelessly aimed to win the press director's approval. Reflecting on this, Yoon-ho decides to call Hyun-ho and heads to his office, only to overhear a colleague mentioning Hyun-ho's upcoming marriage. Stunned, Yoon-ho meets his gaze across the room. One of the grandmothers who raised Hyun-ho reveals that she has breast cancer. Despite encouragement from the others, and Hyun-ho himself to seek medical help, she firmly declines. In a heartfelt moment, she shares her final wish for Hyun-ho to get married and start a family of his own. A new resident, Yoon Cho-rong, who recently joined their household, eagerly volunteers to marry Hyun-ho, expressing that her dream is to become part of his family and care for the grandmothers. Later, in a private conversation, Cho-rong assures Hyun-ho that her offer is genuine and she feels capable of supporting him and the grandmothers as his wife. Yoon-ho overhears talk of Hyun-ho's possible wedding and is devastated. Distracted and overwhelmed, she struggles through work, eventually faltering during a live broadcast, her mind overtaken by thoughts of Hyun-ho marrying someone else. The CEO reprimands her sharply, but she remains silent. Even when her team manager approaches, Yoon-ho continues to sit in silence, lost in her thoughts. Later, on the rooftop, Yoon-ho confronts Hyun-ho with unfiltered emotions, reminding him of how their relationship ended because he didn't want marriage. Yet now, the prospect of him marrying someone else seems to be unfolding without hesitation. Meanwhile, at the office, Jo Yeon drifts into memories of his last conversation with Yoon-ho. Seeking a break from his thoughts, he convinces Hae-yoon to join him at their favorite udon spot. As they eat, Jo Yeon, almost as if talking to himself, reflects on how his heart has only ever truly belonged to one person. He shares that, if given a second chance with Hae-ri, he'd treat her differently. Afterward, he thanks Hae-yoon for the restaurant suggestion, admitting he really enjoys the food. The next day, Yoon-ho continues to spiral, caught up in memories of her early days with Hyun-ho, particularly a moment when he lost his mother's necklace. She remembers his tears and how she had tried to lift his spirits, suggesting they go out for dinner together. Lost in these thoughts, Yoon-ho misses her subway stop and arrives late to the radio station. This incident prompts the press director to dismiss her from all her programs, sealing her fate at work. Hyun-ho, seeing the necklace in his car, visits one of the grandmothers to share his intentions, seeking her advice. She reminds him that without a family of his own, he might face loneliness when the grandmothers are gone. Meanwhile, at Media in Seoul, Hae-yoon shares with Jo Yeon her view that people can hold two hearts, mentioning how one of their colleagues casually dates her while being committed to someone else. This comment stirs something in Jo Yeon, giving him pause. Upon hearing of Yoon-ho's firing, the team manager is visibly upset, but Yoon-ho herself appears unfazed. Later, talking to Ji-yeon, she reveals how deeply hurt she actually is, and he does his best to console her. At home, Yoon-ho opens her diary, her first entry painfully confessing, "I hate myself." Hyun-ho, feeling tense, sits with the grandmothers, who try to talk to him. After a while, he decides to visit Yoon-ho's apartment, but as he arrives and recalls the painful memory of their breakup on those same steps, he hesitates and ultimately chooses not to see her. The next day at the office, Yoon-ho is missing, and in Hae-ri's diary, a new entry appears. "Since Yoon-ho has failed to find happiness, I will be taking over." A flashback reveals the truth about the real Ju Hae-ri. She had been a solitary figure on her graduation trip, keeping to herself as others celebrated. One night, as the group enjoyed themselves, Hae-ri found herself by the pool, entranced by a firefly. She followed it and became lost in the forest, disappearing into the night. In the present, it's been a month since Yoon-ho vanished. She has been fully replaced in her announcer roles, and no one has seen her. Both Hyun-ho and Jo Yeon attempt to contact her, but her phone lies untouched at home, showing 72 missed calls. Hyun-ho, speaking with his team manager, learns he'll be returning to broadcasting. The manager then asks if he's truly planning to marry, to which Hyun-ho firmly replies that marriage isn't in his plans. Meanwhile, Jo Yeon waits every day, hoping for a response from Hae-ri, but his calls and texts go unanswered. Elsewhere, in a conversation with Ji-yeon, Cho-rong admits that she genuinely has feelings for Hyun-ho, unaware he's within earshot. Later, They discuss how he once briefly considered marriage when she said she could handle his lifestyle. But now, he tells her frankly that marriage is not in their future, putting an end to the possibility once and for all. Back home, Shin Young, whose husband had left years ago to avoid arrest, returns to the household just as Hyuno's grandmother shows signs of recovery from her cancer. At Media and Soul's office, Jo-yeon casually asks colleagues what it means when an announcer is removed from all their projects. Hae-yoon replies that it usually indicates they've either resigned or are on a sabbatical. Eventually, Jo-yeon sits down with Hyuno and reveals the truth about Yoon-ho's illness, explaining that he has been in a relationship with her other identity, Ju Hae-ri. Their conversation is tense and awkward, with Hyuno initially shocked by the idea of Yoon-ho dating someone else. Jo-yeon, however, pushes him to consider the pain Yoon-ho endured to reach this point, questioning if he even grasps the hardship she's faced. Shaken, Hyuno abruptly leaves, but then recalls the psychiatric clinic where he once dropped off Yoon-ho. He heads there to speak with the doctor, intending to ask about her condition, but the doctor declines to disclose anything about Yoon-ho's case. Instead, they shift the conversation to Hyuno himself. He admits he's heartbroken and never truly intended to end his relationship with Yoon-ho. Troubled by the possibility that he contributed to her illness, Hyuno confesses his guilt. The doctor reassures him, explaining that many factors contribute to dissociative identity disorder, and he alone is not responsible for its development. Later, Hyuno hears from Jae-young about the parking lot where Yoon-ho, as Hae-ri, had been working and decides to visit. Speaking with the other parking attendant, he learns that Hae-ri had been working there for the past 3-4 years, coinciding exactly with the time of his breakup with Yoon-ho. Deeply affected, he returns home, going straight to his room, where he breaks down in tears, comforted by his grandmother. The following day, one of the announcers asks Ji-yeon to pose as her boyfriend, but he declines. Just as he's leaving, she mentions having possibly seen Yoon-ho during one of her shoots. Meanwhile, Hyuno receives a call from the police requesting to speak with Yoon-ho. At the same time, Jo-yeon visits the parking lot where Hae-ri works and informs Min-young that he intends to file a missing persons report for Hae-ri. As he continues to search, he finds old photos of the real Ju Hae-ri, piecing together more of the story. Hyun-oh heads to the station to pick up Yoon-ho, but as he prepares to sign release papers, the police inform him that she's listed as Ji Hae-ri, who has been missing for 10 years. The officers also explain that she has been living in a tent-like cabin in the mountains. When Hyun-oh finally sees her, he notices a fresh scar on her hand. Hyuno sits across from the woman before him, uncertain if he's with Yoon-ho in her Hae-ri persona or the real Hae-ri. His mind drifts back to memories of his early relationship with Yoon-ho, remembering when he first realized he was truly interested in her. Meanwhile, Ji-yeon takes a bus to the location where the announcer mentioned spotting Yoon-ho. Reflecting on their past, he recalls his initial attraction to her when they met, though he soon learned she was with Hyun-oh. Over time, however, his feelings grew, stirred by her friendly and warm personality. At home, Hyun-oh carefully asks Hae-ri if her recent wound hurts, but she remains silent. He presses gently, asking if she remembers him, and it's then revealed that this is not Hae-ri, it's Yoon-ho. Discovering her diary nearby, Hyun-oh begins to read through it, piecing together her internal struggles. Returning to Yoon-ho, he asks what he should call her, since she's neither fully Yoon-ho nor Hae-ri at this moment. She gives no response. Hyun-oh then recalls aloud a memory from when she was in her Hae-ri persona, hoping to reach her, but she remains silent, locked in her own world. Jo-yeon calls Hae-ri's phone, and Hyun-oh answers, letting him know that Yoon-ho has returned and is safe. Later, Jo-yeon arrives at Yoon-ho's home. Just as he's about to go inside, Hyun-oh tells him that she's asleep. Jo-yeon persistently asks if it's really Hae-ri or Yoon-ho. At that moment, Ji-yeon also arrives, and the three head out for a drink. As they talk, they end up debating who should be responsible for Yoon-ho's care, given her illness. Finally, Hyun-oh stands and asserts that, as the oldest, he'll be the one to look after her, then leaves. In the morning, as Hyun-oh and Yoon-ho are outside, they find Ju-yeon waiting. Hyun-oh steps between them, blocking Ju-yeon's path, but Ju-yeon, with tears in his eyes, calls out to Yoon-ho, saying he doesn't care which identity she holds. He loves her for simply being herself. Hearing this, Yoonho runs to Jo-yeon and embraces him tightly. Back at the office, Hyun-oh is preoccupied with thoughts of Yoonho and Joo-yeon. A conversation with Ji-yeon reveals that Yoonho had been living in the mountains, holding onto a drawing he had made of his mother's necklace. Ji-yeon's words help Hyun-oh grasp just how much love and resilience Yoonho had shown him all along. Despite the challenges, Yoonho sits down with Jo-yeon and begins to share everything from her time away. She recounts how, in the mountains, she tried to live as Haeri, hoping to understand the happiness her sister once felt. She even resorted to self-harm, struggling to fully embody Haeri, but happiness eluded her. This conversation becomes a heartfelt farewell, as she explains that she can never truly be Haeri. Jo-yeon, visibly moved, tells her he cares for her regardless of her identity, yet she thanks him for everything, and he looks at her with helpless sadness. Later, at the office, Hyun-oh is overwhelmed with memories of Yoonho. He rushes to her apartment and calls out to her, and they find each other on the familiar staircase where they once broke up. They run into each other's arms, meeting each other's gaze, eyes filled with tears. Silently, they embrace and share a kiss, and Yoonho softly thanks him for coming back to her. Back in her apartment, the two sit together, sharing quiet confessions of how they missed each other deeply, even during the days they were in each other's presence. In the past, Yoonho and Hyun-oh had a light-hearted conversation while he was hanging laundry. Yoonho complimented his scent, telling him she liked it. Hyun-oh smiled in response and began to tease her playfully about always being messy. In the present day, after 4 years of separation, they have reconciled. They kissed, went to her apartment, and Hyun-oh spoke tenderly to Yoonho's inner child, saying he wanted to hear everything about her life, including all the struggles she'd faced. Young Yoonho then opened up about Haeri, explaining how unhappy she had been and how she tried to understand Haeri's life. When Hyun-oh asked if she had learned to be happy, Yoonho replied that happiness, for her, was being with him. Meanwhile, Jo-yeon is struggling to cope with the reality of his short-lived romantic relationship. His co-workers watch him with concern as he breaks down, visibly distressed and devastated by his heartbreak. Later, Yoonho visits her colleague Min-young at the parking lot and reveals the truth about Haeri. Min-young is shocked upon hearing about Haeri's disorder. Yoonho goes on to share that she thinks about Joo-yeon often. She expresses her gratitude to Min-young, thanking her sincerely for being her friend and for all the support she has given. As they continue talking, Jo-yeon arrives and calls her by the name Haeri. Yoonho gently corrects him, telling him that she now goes by Yoonho and no longer uses the name Haeri. Jo-yeon understands, and Yoonho suggests that they end their relationship on good terms, saying that Haeri genuinely likes him. They decide to go on one last date to end it in good terms. Yoonho returns to work with renewed energy, ready to face her responsibilities. The team manager is upset, scolding her for being absent for a week. Yoonho, however, responds by pointing out that she did at least come back. Later, she shares with Hyun-oh about her good breakup date with Jo-yeon. Hyun-oh tries to act like a calm, supportive boyfriend, casually asking if it was just a breakup and nothing more. She reassures him, and they shift the conversation to focus on work. Ji-yeon approaches her, surprised to see her back, and Yoonho confirms she's fully returned and feeling good, and mentions she's back together with Hyun-oh as well. She heads back to her desk and catches a glimpse of Hyun-oh shaving, quietly admiring him. They both decide to leave work early, sneaking out by jumping the fence. At home, Yoonho begins sorting through her clothes, holding up different outfits to get Hyun-oh's opinion on what she should wear. He playfully criticizes each option until they eventually settle on an outfit, and she gets ready to go. A little later, Jo-yeon arrives to pick her up for their good breakup date. They go out for sushi and enjoy a meal together. Afterward, in the parking lot, Jo-yeon finally accepts the end of their relationship, letting her go with a sense of closure and expressing genuine happiness for her. They shake hands, holding on for a moment before Hyun-oh suddenly appears, interrupting by separating their hands. With a hint of possessiveness, he remarks that it's getting late and they should go. After saying goodbye to Jo-yeon, he walks her to his car while she playfully teases him about being jealous. The next day, while they were together, Hyun-oh asked Yoonho if he could take her somewhere, and she agreed. It turned out he needed to attend a family photo session and wanted her to join him. For the first time, he was introducing Yoonho to his family. After the photo, they all gathered for dinner. Yoonho was chatty, responding eagerly to questions and sharing stories. She even mentioned how amazed she was at the number of grandmothers Hyun-oh had, and continued to talk about him fondly. Eventually, Hyun-oh gently led her away from the table and gave her a tour of the house. During the tour, they chatted about his hobbies outside of work, adding a new layer to their connection. Overall, the grandmothers seemed pleased with Yoon-ho, and she felt comfortable around his family. Jae-young receives a tense call from a business owner's son, leaving him anxious. This call is from the family of a business owner who lost his job after Jae-young reported an incorrect story. The team manager, noticing Jae-young's distress, crouches down beside him under the table to ask what's going on. Jae-young confesses that he was demoted due to the error and is now scared to answer the calls from the business owner's son. Finally, the manager kicked Jae-young and went to answer a phone that was ringing. It was from the upper management. After this call, he contacts Yoon-ho with some exciting news. She's been assigned to cover the 7 p.m. news slot. Yoon-ho is thrilled at the opportunity. After she leaves, Jae-young recalls his conversation with the director. The director had explained that the regular announcer was on leave and wanted Yoon-ho to take over. Yoon-ho excitedly shared her news with Hyun-oh about the opportunity to cover the news slot. She then asked if they could go to the palace for their first official date, but he hesitated, concerned that people might recognize him there. As they discussed it, Jae-young suddenly appeared, looking miserable from the constant calls from the business owner's son. Meanwhile, at media in Seoul, Hae-yeon asked Jo-yeon if he would even notice if she were gone. He bluntly replied that her absence wouldn't make a difference, hurting her feelings. She quietly thanked him for his time and walked away. Later, Hae-yeon submitted her resignation letter for unclear reasons. Back at work, Yoon-ho prepared for her first news broadcast. Both the team manager and the director watched nervously, but were relieved and pleased when she performed well. Afterward, the manager informed her that the director wanted to take her out for dinner, but she had other plans. He also told her the director wanted her to prepare for an audition for the permanent 7 p.m. slot. Yoon-ho met up with Hyun-oh to share the good news. Just then, Jae-young, hiding under the table, begged Hyun-oh to take over his dealings with the business owner's son. Annoyed, Hyun-oh took the call and agreed to meet the son in place of Jae-young. Later, in the parking lot, as he was about to head out, Hyun-oh received a call from Yoon-ho, who told him she was waiting by the sunset. He promised to join her shortly. However, as they were talking, a truck suddenly started coming his way. A drunken man got out of the truck, shouting that he had come to kill him. Yoon-ho heard everything through the open phone, lying on the ground. Jae-young heroically stepped in front of the oncoming truck, which ended up hitting him instead of Hyun-oh. When the drunk driver got out of the vehicle, Hyun-oh quickly ran to Jae-young, who was lying on the ground, covered in blood. He picked up his phone, ended the call with Yoon-ho, and immediately called for an ambulance. At the hospital, the team leader arrived to find Hyun-oh standing motionless, frozen in shock. Attempting to talk to him, the leader realized that Hyun-oh was too disoriented to respond, so he helped by gently wiping the blood from Hyun-oh's hands. Meanwhile, the press director demanded Jae-young return to work, unaware of his severe injuries. The director's assistants informed him that Jae-young was critically injured in the ICU. However, Hyun-oh, feeling guilty that Jae-young sacrificed himself, refused. Despite the director's apologies and attempts to convince him, Hyun-oh firmly declined. When Hyun-oh left the office, Yoon-ho met him, holding his hands gently. She led him to a quiet room, asking if he was okay. He admitted that he wasn't, and she offered him comfort, understanding the depth of his feelings. Jo-yeon noticed Hae-yeon's absence and looked around but couldn't find her. It turns out that Hae-yeon had joined PPS, where she quickly bonded with Yoon-ho. Yoon-ho shared details about Hae-ri's situation, confiding in Hae-yeon about her work at the parking lot and asking her to keep it a secret. At the office, tensions mounted as Hyun-oh continued to refuse the 9 p.m. news slot. Despite updates that Jae-young was recovering well, colleagues urged him to step up, noting that Jae-young was now mobile. But Hyun-oh, though torn, felt unable to accept the position. Back at PPS, concern grew as Hyun-oh locked himself in his office. His colleagues gathered outside the door, unsure how to help, until Yoon-ho arrived with her own key. She entered quietly, apologizing for interrupting, and hugged him. Hyun-oh began to open up, venting his frustrations, and Yoon-ho listened, offering steady comfort. She assured him he could manage the challenge, and gently encouraged him to take the news role, to ensure Jae-young would have a position to return to. After leaving Hyun-oh's office, Yoon-ho broke down in tears. Concerned, her colleagues gathered around, asking what had happened. She explained that he'd agreed to take on the role. The broadcast went off without a hitch, with the director watching with evident satisfaction. The manager approached, expressing appreciation and telling him he had done well. Later, Hyun-oh returned home, where Yoon-ho was waiting for him. They shared a kiss and went inside the apartment, spending quality time together. In a tender moment, Hyun-oh surprised her with a necklace, offering it as a gift. Meanwhile, Jo-yeon approached his boss to ask about Hae-yeon, realizing he was the only one she had blocked. After a few attempts, he managed to reach her through Yoon-ho. Amused, Hae-yeon reminded him of his comment about not noticing her absence. Playfully, she suggested they could meet for meals until she got a boyfriend, and hinted that he was welcome to express any interest. Jo-yeon listened, smiling at her boldness. To close this chapter, she decided to gather everyone who had known her as Hae-ri for a final farewell at Hyun-oh's home. Friends, including Jo-yeon, gathered to say their goodbyes to Hae-ri. During the gathering, Hae-yeon and Jo-yeon shared a brief but friendly interaction. Then, in a heartwarming moment, Hyun-oh proposed to Yoon-ho. Overjoyed, she hugged him, and the grandmothers, delighted to see him ready to settle down, cheered along with everyone else. Later, Ji-yeon approached his sister, inviting her to meet their estranged mother. She initially declined, bitter over their abandonment as children, but changed her mind as he was about to leave. Meanwhile, Hae-yeon unblocked Jo-yeon, signaling a new start. Finally, Hyun-oh and Yoon-ho found themselves together in the meadow, where Hae-ri had once gone missing, now filled with happiness and peace as they embraced the future ahead. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.